Take Hana and leave this house tonight.
For one terrible second, Nia Carter believed her husband had finally chosen the family that never truly wanted their daughter. Across the dining room, Sun-hee Park sat perfectly still, while the smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth. Their 1-year-old daughter, Hana, slept against Nia's chest, unaware that 20 relatives had just watched her grandmother erase her from a family portrait. Joon-ho stood beside the long table, expression unreadable, as his mother calmly repeated that some family traditions were larger than individual feelings. Nia had heard softer versions of that sentence for months, always wrapped in etiquette, legacy, reputation, or concern for the company. Tonight, the wrapping had finally come off, and everyone in the room could see exactly what was underneath. Joon-ho reached toward his left hand, removed the black jade signet ring his father had given him at 30, and placed it beside his untouched wine glass. His mother's smile disappeared, because that ring represented more than inheritance. It represented the son she believed would always choose the Park family first. Then Joon-ho lifted Nia's coat from the chair, picked up the diaper bag, and walked around the table toward his wife. He did not ask his mother for permission, and he did not look at the relatives who had suddenly stopped breathing. What happened next would cost him a home, threaten his position, expose a secret inside his own company, and force his mother to confront the prejudice she had disguised as tradition. But none of them had reached that night by accident, and Nia had not entered that house as some helpless outsider waiting to be rescued. If this moment already has you wondering how a marriage built on love reached such a breaking point, stay with us. If stories about family, dignity, betrayal, courage, and second chances speak to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you powerful stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary choices every week, and you will not want to miss the next one. Before we go back, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether that's a city, state, or country. Now let's return 18 months earlier, to a rainy medical technology conference in Boston, where Nia Carter had no intention of falling in love with anyone. Nia was 32, 5'7", warm dark brown skin, natural curls pinned high, and the kind of posture that made nervous people straighten without knowing why. She worked as a biomedical engineer specializing in human factors and optical health sensors, a field most people stopped asking about after the second technical sentence. Nia liked that arrangement, because she preferred proving what she knew to performing intelligence for rooms that had already underestimated her. Her mother, Denise, used to say Nia had been born with 2 gifts, a steady hand and absolutely no talent for pretending nonsense made sense. That second gift had caused trouble in school, at work, and occasionally at Thanksgiving. But it had also built the career Nia was proud of. At the Boston conference, she was scheduled to speak on a panel about bias in consumer health devices, a subject several executives considered uncomfortable until regulators started asking questions. One of those executives was Park Joon-ho, the newly appointed chief executive of Haneul Health Technologies, a Korean company expanding aggressively into the American market. He was 36, tall, disciplined, and famous in business magazines for turning a sleepy family subsidiary into the fastest-growing home health company in Asia. He was also running 12 minutes late, which meant Nia disliked him before they had properly met. When he finally entered the green room, rain darkened the shoulders of his coat, and 3 assistants followed him with the expression of people apologizing on his behalf. Joon-ho stopped in front of Nia, bowed his head slightly, and apologized himself before any assistant could speak. That earned him exactly 1 point back. Their panel began badly, because the moderator opened by claiming technology was fundamentally neutral, and only became biased through bad human use. Nia watched Joon-ho glance toward her, already knowing she was about to disagree publicly with a sentence he had just nodded along to. She explained that sensors were designed by people, tested on selected populations, calibrated through assumptions, and often marketed more broadly than their validation justified. Then she placed a small fingertip oxygen sensor on the table, and asked how many executives in the room knew its accuracy range across different skin tones. Nobody raised a hand. Joon-ho did not pretend he knew, which surprised her more than any polished answer would have. After the panel, he found her beside the coffee station, and asked whether she would review one of Haneul's unpublished infant monitor studies under confidentiality. Nia laughed once and asked whether that was his version of flirting, because most men started with dinner before offering non-disclosure agreements. For the first time that afternoon, Joon-ho looked genuinely caught off guard, then laughed hard enough that one assistant glanced over in alarm. He told her it had not been flirting, though his face suggested he was reconsidering whether it should have been. Nia accepted the study anyway, on the condition that Han'll pay her consulting rate and not expect polite conclusions. Joon-ho said polite conclusions were usually expensive and useless, which earned him another point. They spent the next 3 weeks arguing over data across video calls, and somewhere between confidence intervals and usability failures, the arguments became conversations. Joon-ho learned that Nia hated sweet coffee, loved old jazz records, and called her mother every Sunday even when they had nothing important to discuss. Nia learned that Joon-ho slept 4 hours too little, read history when stressed, and carried family responsibility like an invisible briefcase he never put down. He was the second son of Park Do-yeon, chairman of the wider Park family holding company, though his older sister Ji-won had left Korea years earlier. Whenever Nia asked why Ji-won rarely appeared in family profiles, Joon-ho answered carefully, then changed the subject with unusual speed. That became the first thing about him she decided not to push. 3 months later, Joon-ho returned to Boston for another meeting and asked Nia to dinner without mentioning a contract, device, or regulatory filing. She told him his technique was improving. He took her to a small Ethiopian restaurant, instead of somewhere designed to impress investors, because he had remembered her complaining about expensive food without seasoning. Nia noticed that detail and disliked how much it mattered. Their relationship did not move quickly, despite what both families later assumed from the final result. They spent 9 months traveling between Boston, New York, Seoul, and whichever airport had temporarily become Joon-ho's office. Nia watched him treat junior engineers with the same attention he gave board members, and Joon-ho watched her stop a hospital procurement deal because a product study excluded older patients. They did not fall in love because they were opposites. They fell in love because both of them were stubborn about the same things. Accuracy mattered. Promises mattered. People mattered more than appearances. At least that was what Nia believed they both understood. The first time Joon-ho mentioned marriage, they were sitting on her kitchen floor assembling a bookshelf neither of them had read the instructions for. He said he had spent most of his life assuming marriage would be arranged around duty, convenience, and whatever his family could tolerate. Then he looked at the crooked shelf between them and said he wanted one decision in his life that belonged entirely to him. Nia asked whether he was proposing beside a broken piece of Swedish furniture. He said apparently he was. She made him stand up and try again, mostly because she loved him and partly because she had standards. Joon-ho proposed with no photographer, no restaurant audience, and no family ring. Only a simple diamond he had chosen without consulting his mother. Nia said yes before he finished the second sentence. Denise cried when Nia called, then immediately asked whether Joon-ho understood that marrying her daughter meant acquiring a mother-in-law who did not respect international time zones. Joon-ho said he had survived corporate restructuring and believed he could adapt. His own mother's response was different. Sun-hee Park invited Nia to Seoul for what she called a quiet family weekend before any engagement announcement became public. Nia arrived prepared to be nervous, but not prepared for the Park family residence to sit behind stone walls on a wooded hillside above the city. The house was not technically a palace, but it had enough staff and polished silence to make that distinction feel unnecessarily legalistic. Sun-hee greeted Nia in a cream hanbok-inspired jacket, took both her hands, and smiled with the careful warmth of someone conducting a very important interview. She complimented Nia's education, asked about Denise, and said Joon-ho had never brought a woman home with such seriousness before. For the first hour, Nia wondered whether she had worried for nothing. Then Sun-hee asked whether Nia intended to continue wearing her hair naturally at formal company functions. The question landed softly enough that Joon-ho almost missed what was underneath it. Nia smiled and said her hair had successfully attended every professional function of her adult life without causing a market collapse. Do-hyun laughed into his tea before he could stop himself. Sun-hee smiled too, though hers arrived half a second later. That evening, Joon-ho apologized in their hotel room, and said his mother could be traditional, controlling, and overly concerned with public presentation. Nia asked whether traditional was going to become a useful word for things nobody wanted to name honestly. Joon-ho hesitated just long enough to irritate her. He said he would not let anyone disrespect her, then kissed her forehead like a man closing a subject he hoped was finished. Nia let it close that night, because one strange question did not define a person, and she had no interest in entering marriage searching for enemies. The wedding happened 4 months later in Seoul, followed by a smaller celebration in Boston for Denise and Nia's friends. Sun-hee behaved beautifully in public, praising Nia's career and telling reporters her son had chosen a brilliant American woman with a strong family. Privately, she corrected the placement of Nia's jewelry, asked the stylist to soften her lipstick, and suggested a different hairstyle for the official family portrait. Nia declined the hairstyle without drama, and Joon-ho backed her immediately when the stylist looked uncertain. That was the first small payoff Nia allowed herself to enjoy. Her husband noticed, and this time he did not explain his mother away. During the wedding dinner, Sun-hee introduced Nia to an elderly relative as Joon-ho's American wife, without mentioning her name. Joon-ho interrupted gently, and introduced her again as Dr. Nia Carter, biomedical engineer, and his wife, in that order. The relative smiled, asked Nia about her research, and spent 15 minutes discussing a home blood pressure monitor she distrusted. Sun-hee said nothing, but Nia saw the muscle in her jaw tighten. Marriage began in a high-rise apartment across the river, not in the Park family residence, because Nia insisted they needed a home that belonged to both of them. Sun-hee disliked the decision but accepted it publicly, while reminding Joon-ho that future children should spend significant time in the family house. At first, Nia and Sun-hee established an uneasy peace built on short lunches, carefully chosen topics, and both women pretending certain earlier moments had meant nothing. Nia continued consulting internationally, and began advising a Seoul University lab studying fairness in wearable medical sensors. Joon-ho's company, Hanol Health, was developing an infant wellness monitor called Luminest, designed to track breathing patterns, temperature, movement, and pulse trends during sleep. The product mattered enormously to Joon-ho, because it was his first major launch since becoming CEO without his father's direct supervision. Nia refused to work on Luminest officially after they married, explaining that no good could come from mixing her marriage with an internal safety review. Joon-ho agreed, though he still complained about engineering problems at breakfast until Nia threatened to invoice him by the minute. 6 months into their marriage, Nia discovered she was pregnant after becoming violently offended by the smell of Joon-ho's favorite seaweed soup. She took 3 tests before believing the first one, then sat on the bathroom floor laughing and crying while Joon-ho knocked outside asking whether she was sick. When she opened the door and handed him the test, he stared so long that Nia had to ask whether Korean CEOs received special training for pregnancy announcements. Joon-ho sank to the floor beside her instead. He pressed his forehead against her stomach, though there was nothing to feel yet, and whispered something in Korean she did not understand. When Nia asked, he said it meant their child would never have to wonder whether she had been wanted. That sentence stayed with Nia, because wanting a child was simple in a bathroom with 2 people and a positive test. The harder question would become whether the people around them could love that child without asking her to become easier to explain. Sun-hee cried when they announced the pregnancy, and for several weeks Nia believed the baby might finally soften whatever distance remained between them. She sent food, arranged a driver for appointments Nia had not asked for, and ordered enough prenatal supplements to supply a small clinic. She also began talking about the baby, as though certain details had already been decided. The child would have a Korean first name, attend a particular preschool, spend summers at the family residence, and eventually appear in foundation photographs. Nia listened until Sun-hee referred to the baby as the next visible generation of the Park family. Then Nia reminded her that the baby would also be a Carter, would have an American grandmother, and might grow up hating formal photographs entirely. Sun-hee laughed, but the conversation changed after that. At 14 weeks, an ultrasound showed the baby was a girl. Joon-ho smiled so widely the technician smiled with him. While Nia immediately imagined Denise buying tiny sneakers in completely unreasonable quantities. Sun-hee's reaction was polite rather than joyful. and she asked whether early tests could ever be mistaken about sex. Joon-ho told her they were having a daughter, not receiving a quarterly forecast that might be revised. Do-hyun laughed again, and Sun-hee changed the subject. The comments about appearance began later, never directly enough for Joon-ho to hear the full weight of them. Sun-hee wondered whether the baby would inherit Joon-ho's straight hair, his lighter complexion, or what she called his very Korean eyes. Nia answered once that genetics had not requested a design meeting, and they would both meet the baby when she arrived. Sun-hee smiled and said she was simply curious. Nia knew curiosity when she heard it, and this was something else wearing its coat. At 28 weeks, Sun-hee brought a framed photograph of Joon-ho as a baby and placed it in the nursery without asking. She said she hoped the little girl looked exactly like him. Nia asked whether looking like her mother would be a disappointment. Sun-hee's silence lasted only 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was enough. She recovered by saying every grandmother imagined seeing her own family in a new baby. Nia replied that she understood, because Denise felt exactly the same way. That evening, Nia told Joon-ho about the conversation without softening it. He sat on the edge of their bed, rubbed both hands over his face, and admitted he had heard similar comments growing up about which cousins looked properly park. Nia asked why he had never mentioned that before. Joon-ho said because until now, he had considered it one of his mother's many harmless obsessions with lineage. Nia told him lineage stopped being harmless the moment it taught a child that one half of her face needed apologizing for. Joon-ho promised he understood. Nia believed him, though understanding a problem and standing against the person causing it would soon prove to be different skills. Hana arrived 3 weeks early during a summer thunderstorm that flooded 2 streets near the hospital and trapped Do-hyun's driver in traffic. Nia labored for 14 hours, cursed Joon-ho in 2 languages, and squeezed his hand hard enough to leave 4 crescent marks in his palm. When the doctor finally lifted their daughter into view, Hana announced herself with a furious cry that made Nia laugh through exhausted tears. She had Nia's deep brown skin, a thick cap of dark curls, Joon-ho's narrow chin, and a tiny crease beside one eye that belonged unmistakably to him. Joon-ho cried openly when the nurse placed Hana on Nia's chest, then spent 10 minutes pretending he had not. He kept touching their daughter's fingers, as though each one required separate confirmation that she was real. Denise joined by video from Boston at 4 in the morning her time, wearing a bonnet and shouting loudly enough for 3 nurses to hear. She declared Hana perfect, accused Nia of hiding the good cheekbones in the family, and ordered Joon-ho to keep sending photographs until her flight. Sun-hee arrived 2 hours later with Do-hyun, fresh flowers, a silk baby blanket, and an expression Nia would remember long after the flowers died. She stopped beside the hospital bassinet and looked down without speaking. Her eyes moved from Hana's curls to her cheeks, then to Nia, and finally to Joon-ho, as though someone had quietly changed an agreement. Do-hyun leaned over his granddaughter first and immediately smiled. He said she had Joon-ho's chin, then laughed when Hana opened one eye and frowned at him like an offended executive. Sun-hee still had not touched her. Nia watched the hesitation become a choice, and something inside her hardened before anyone said a word. Then, Sun-hee asked the nurse whether newborn complexions sometimes changed significantly during the first few months. The nurse blinked, uncertain whether she had heard correctly, while Joon-ho slowly turned toward his mother. Nia answered before anyone else could rescue the moment. She said Hana's skin did not need to change, because there was nothing wrong with the color she had arrived wearing. Sun-hee immediately insisted she had meant only that newborns often changed in appearance, and Nia was making an innocent question sound ugly. Joon-ho told his mother to stop. It was quiet, controlled, and immediate. And for a moment Nia felt the relief of seeing him recognize the line after it had finally been crossed. Sun-hee set the silk blanket on a chair, kissed Joon-ho's cheek, and left without holding her granddaughter. Do-hyun stayed another 40 minutes. Before leaving, he lifted Hana carefully against his chest, and said she was the first Park granddaughter born in 13 years. Then he looked toward the door his wife had used and added that anyone too foolish to enjoy that fact was wasting valuable time. That became the first real family victory after Hana's birth, small but unmistakable. Nia did not need everyone to adore her, But she needed her daughter to grow up seeing adults challenge cruelty instead of politely surviving it. The first month at home was a blur of feeding schedules, laundry, medical appointments, and arguments over which exhausted parent had last changed a diaper. Joon-ho took 2 weeks completely away from Hanul, a decision that caused business reporters to invent 3 imaginary corporate crises before breakfast. He learned to warm bottles, swaddle badly, and walk the apartment at 3 in the morning while Hannah slept against his shoulder. Nia watched him become a father in ordinary moments, which made the growing problem with Sun-hee more painful rather than less. Sun-hee visited twice during those first weeks, always bringing expensive gifts and always finding reasons not to hold Hannah for long. She complained that the baby cried whenever she approached, though Hannah cried whenever any adult interrupted a nap, including both parents. She suggested a Korean nanny who could teach Hannah the household routines she would eventually need at the family residence. Nia said Hannah was 5 weeks old and currently had only 2 household routines, eating and objecting to pants. Sun-hee did not laugh. At 6 weeks, family photographs from the birth announcement appeared on Hanul's internal website, but only one image showed Hannah clearly. The official social announcement used a photograph of Joon-ho holding a wrapped bundle from an angle that concealed most of the baby's face. Nia noticed because she had personally sent the communications office a photograph showing all 3 of them together. Joon-ho called the communications director immediately. The director sounded frightened and said the image selection had come through the Family Foundation office, not Hanul's normal communications team. Sun-hee chaired that foundation. Joon-ho confronted her privately and returned home 3 hours later looking exhausted. He said his mother claimed she had chosen the more formal image because the family preferred not to expose a newborn's face publicly. Nia asked whether Sun-hee had held the same privacy concern when her sister-in-law's pale-skinned grandson was born 2 years earlier. Joon-ho had no answer. The next morning, he ordered Hanul's communications team to replace the photograph with the one Nia had originally selected. He did it without announcing the dispute, but the image mattered to Nia because it placed Hannah where she belonged, visible beside both parents. Sun-hee did not call for 4 days. That silence might have become a useful boundary if a different problem had not arrived from Joon-ho's office. Hanul's Luminescent infant monitor had entered its final validation stage, and the engineering team was celebrating results that looked unusually clean. Joon-ho mentioned the numbers one evening while sterilizing bottle parts, mostly because he was relieved after months of delays. Nia listened until he said the optical pulse module had shown less than 2% variance across the final infant simulation set. She stopped drying the bottle in her hand. Nia asked what he meant by infant simulation set, because optical validation depended heavily on how real-world tissue and pigmentation were represented. Joon-ho said he did not know the exact composition, and immediately realized from her face that this answer was not going to end the conversation. Nia reminded him that darker skin could affect the performance of some optical systems when testing populations or calibration methods were inadequate. She did not accuse Hanul's engineers of wrongdoing. She asked one question Joon-ho could take to them the next morning. How many infants, or validated tissue models representing deeper skin pigmentation, had been included in the final calibration dataset? Joon-ho sent the question before going to bed. The answer arrived at 6:17 the next morning, and it was worse than Nia expected. The final dataset included multiple ages and body types, but the deepest pigmentation range represented less than 4% of calibration samples. One testing contractor had classified several synthetic models as diverse based on nationality, rather than measured optical characteristics. Nia read the summary twice, then handed the phone back to her husband. She told him this did not prove the device was unsafe, but it proved Hanul did not yet know enough to claim equal performance. Joon-ho canceled his morning meetings and ordered an independent external audit before the product could advance toward launch. His chief product officer protested that delaying validation could cost millions and hand a seasonal advantage to their largest competitor. Joon-ho replied that launching a device before understanding who it worked for could cost something harder to recover than money. Nia did not attend those meetings, did not ask for credit, and did not access a single confidential engineering file beyond what Joon-ho was permitted to share. Still, News that the CEO's wife had raised the original concern traveled through the company by lunchtime. By the end of the week, it had traveled into Sun-hee's dining room. She invited Nia to lunch and began with 20 minutes of pleasant conversation before asking whether married people should respect boundaries around each other's work. Nia understood the target immediately. She said she agreed completely, which was why she had not joined the Luminest project or requested internal access. Sun-hee asked whether suggesting a multimillion-dollar delay counted as staying outside the project. Nia replied that pointing at a smoke alarm was not the same as setting the building on fire. Sun-hee placed her teacup down carefully. She said Joon-ho had worked for years to prove himself to the board, and a wife should be cautious about making him appear uncertain. Nia asked whether Sun-hee preferred a confident CEO who ignored evidence or a responsible one who checked it. Neither woman raised her voice, which somehow made the conversation sharper. Sun-hee finally said Nia had entered a family where actions carried consequences beyond personal pride. Nia answered that babies using medical devices also lived with consequences beyond corporate pride. They finished lunch without dessert. 3 weeks later, the independent audit returned with evidence that justified Joon-ho's decision. Luminest performed within target ranges for most testing groups, but pulse trend accuracy degraded enough in the deepest pigmentation range to require recalibration and more clinical validation. The problem was fixable, but launching on schedule would have meant advertising a level of universal reliability the data could not support. Joon-ho halted the launch for 4 months and informed the board before the information could become rumor. Several directors were furious about the cost, until the external auditors explained how easily the issue could have become a regulatory and reputational disaster after release. One director asked who had first identified the gap in the validation design. Joon-ho answered truthfully. His wife had asked the question his own team should have asked earlier. Nia learned about that sentence from a junior engineer who sent her a private message, thanking her for making the delay easier to defend internally. She did not need a title at Hanel, but the message gave her a quiet satisfaction no family photograph could provide. Sun-hee saw something different. To her, Nia was no longer merely the foreign wife her son had married, she was someone whose judgment could now influence a company. He considered part of the family body. That changed the conflict from discomfort into strategy. Hana's 100th day celebration should have been simple. Nia wanted a small lunch in their apartment with Denise, the Park grandparents, and a few friends, while Sun-hee insisted tradition required the family residence. Joon-ho suggested a compromise. Hold the traditional meal at the family house, then spend the evening privately with Nia's mother and friends. Nia agreed, because she wanted Hana connected to both sides of her family, not protected from one culture because one person behaved badly. Denise flew to Seoul carrying 2 suitcases, one for herself and one apparently dedicated to baby clothes she had been buying since the first ultrasound. She met Sun-hee with perfect politeness, and enough calm observation to make Nia nervous for entirely different reasons. During the celebration, Sun-hee was attentive whenever older relatives were watching. She held Hana for photographs, complimented her curls, and introduced Denise as the baby's maternal grandmother with a smile polished enough for television. For almost 2 hours, Nia wondered whether public embarrassment had finally forced private behavior to improve. Then a photographer asked for a formal 4-generation family portrait near the garden windows. Sun-hee arranged Do-hyun in the center, called Joon-ho forward, and asked Nia to hand Hana to a nanny while the first photographs were taken. Nia thought she had misunderstood. Sun-hee explained that the foundation wanted several legacy photographs focused on the direct Park line before adding spouses and younger family members. Do-hyun looked at her sharply, because Hana was the direct Park line by every definition available to biology and law. Nia asked why her daughter needed to leave a portrait supposedly celebrating generations of the family. Sun-hee lowered her voice and said there would be many photographs, so there was no reason to create an uncomfortable scene over sequencing. Denise stepped closer, but Nia touched her mother's wrist gently and handled the moment herself. She said Hana would either be in the family portrait with her father, or there would be no photograph of Nia's family at all. The photographer stared at the floor, wishing professional invisibility were a real skill. Joon-ho crossed the room, took Hana from Nia, and stood beside his father with their daughter clearly visible against his dark suit. He told the photographer to begin. Do-yeon moved closer to his granddaughter. Denise joined Nia, and the resulting photograph contained exactly the family Sun-hee had tried to edit. That was another payoff. Immediate enough to matter. But Sun-hee did not forgive the public contradiction. Later, when most guests had moved toward lunch, she cornered Nia near the upstairs nursery and accused her of humiliating an elder in her own home. Nia said humiliation required someone to be diminished, and all she had done was refuse to let her child be removed from a photograph. Sun-hee's restraint finally cracked. She said people were already talking about how different Hana looked from the Park family, and every public appearance invited questions the company did not need. Nia felt the world become very still around that sentence. She asked what questions a healthy baby could possibly create for a medical technology company. Sun-hee replied that Nia knew exactly what she meant and should stop forcing everyone to say uncomfortable things aloud. Nia told her that was precisely the problem. Sun-hee wanted the comfort of prejudice without the ugliness of hearing herself name it. Sun-hee's face changed. She said Nia had been welcomed into a respected Korean family, given protection, status, and opportunities most people would never receive. Nia answered that marriage to Joon-ho had not been an immigration prize, a scholarship, or a corporate promotion. She had married a man, not applied to become grateful property of his mother. Joon-ho entered before Sun-hee could respond, having heard enough from the hallway to understand the shape of the argument. He asked his mother to apologize. Sun-hee refused and said he would understand one day that protecting a family sometimes required making choices outsiders considered cruel. Joon-ho looked toward Nia, then toward Hana sleeping in the crib, and told his mother the conversation was over. For the first time, he left the family house before his mother dismissed him. In the car, Nia did not celebrate. She asked why Sun-hee still had enough power over their lives to keep creating moments where Joon-ho needed to rescue them afterward. Joon-ho said he was trying to change a family system that had existed long before either of them were born. Nia told him she was not asking him to change history. She was asking him to decide what access his mother had to their daughter now. That difference stayed between them for the rest of the drive. Over the next 6 months, Sun-hee became more careful rather than kinder. She stopped making comments. Nia could challenge directly and began using schedules, staff, invitations, and family protocol to create distance instead. Hana was left off 2 foundation event invitations that included other grandchildren, then added only after Joon-ho questioned the omissions. A family aide repeatedly scheduled photographs during Hana's nap times, then described the child as difficult when Nia refused to wake her. Sun-hee bought matching traditional outfits for every young cousin except Hana, claiming she had not known the baby's size. Each event was small enough to explain individually, which was exactly why the pattern became harder to dismiss collectively. Nia started keeping screenshots, messages, and dates. Not because she wanted revenge, but because reality became easier to defend when it had timestamps. She also stopped attending events where Hana was treated as a problem to manage. Joon-ho supported those decisions, but he still maintained a weekly dinner with his parents and continued asking Nia whether reconciliation might eventually be possible. Nia said reconciliation required 2 people walking toward each other, and she was tired of being asked to cross the entire distance alone. Their marriage did not collapse, but a thin crack appeared where Joon-ho's hope for peace kept pressing against Nia's need for protection. At work, the Luma Nest redesign progressed better than expected. The engineering team expanded testing, changed calibration methods, and created a permanent validation standard, requiring measured skin pigmentation ranges, rather than demographic shortcuts. Joon-ho asked Nia whether she would join an external advisory panel after launch, with compensation and full independence from his reporting structure. Nia declined the first offer because the panel still reported ultimately to Hanel's product division. She proposed instead that the company fund an independent university consortium with public methods, external reviewers, and no authority for Joon-ho to suppress unfavorable results. He stared at her proposal for 10 minutes, then said this was why asking her for advice always became expensive. Nia replied that reliable ethics had a terrible habit of costing money before saving it. The board eventually approved the consortium after Joon-ho convinced them transparency would become a competitive advantage rather than a liability. Sun-hee considered that approval another example of Nia gaining influence, without understanding what such changes cost the family. By Hana's first birthday, the tension had become impossible to hide from relatives. Sun-hee insisted the traditional dol janchi be held at the family residence with extended family, senior Hanul directors, and several foundation donors. Nia initially refused. Joon-ho promised there would be no separate photographs, no exclusion, no surprise press, and no decisions about Hana made without both parents. He said he wanted their daughter to have the tradition without inheriting the prejudice attached to one person's behavior. Nia agreed on one condition: if Sun-hee crossed the line again, they would leave immediately without negotiating in front of guests. Joon-ho promised. The morning of the celebration, Hana wore a pale gold hanbok chosen by Nia and Denise together, with a tiny burgundy ribbon tied beneath her curls. She spent the first hour attempting to steal rice cakes, ignoring expensive toys, and charming every relative who allowed her to chew on their fingers. Do-hyun followed her around with the expression of a chairman who had discovered a more important executive. Sun-hee behaved impeccably, until the official photographs began. A foundation photographer arranged the senior family members beneath a large calligraphy panel, while aides quietly moved donors toward the adjoining room. Nia noticed one chair missing from the arrangement before anyone spoke. Then Sun-hee asked the nanny to take Hana upstairs until the formal legacy portrait was finished. Joon-ho turned toward his mother so slowly that the room seemed to notice before he said anything. Nia reminded Sun-hee of the agreement made before the event. Sun-hee replied that this was not about race, but about protecting Hana from public attention and preserving a traditional image for foundation records. Nia asked why every other grandchild was standing beneath the calligraphy panel. No one answered. Then Sun-hee made the mistake that ended months of ambiguity. She said the Park Foundation represented a recognizable family legacy, and Hana's appearance would make the photograph about something else entirely. The words were not shouted. That made them worse. Nia felt Hana shift against her shoulder, sleepy and warm, while 20 adults suddenly discovered urgent reasons to study the carpet. Do-hyun told his wife she had gone too far. Sun-hee snapped that everyone had left her to think about consequences nobody else was willing to name. She accused Nia of turning every family decision into a test of prejudice and Joon-ho of allowing guilt to weaken his judgment. Then, she said Hana would understand when she was older that every family had rules about what represented it publicly. Nia looked directly at her mother-in-law and said her daughter would grow up understanding something simpler. No photograph was worth disappearing inside. She turned toward the hallway. That was when Joon-ho finally spoke. For one terrible second, Nia believed the sentence meant exactly what it sounded like. Sun-hee believed it too, because relief briefly softened her face. Then Joon-ho removed the black jade signet ring from his hand and placed it beside his father's wineglass. He told Nia to take Hana because he needed 5 minutes to collect their things from the upstairs rooms. He said he was leaving with them. The room changed completely. Sun-hee stood so quickly her chair struck the wall behind her. She told her son not to be theatrical, and Joon-ho answered that asking his wife and daughter to endure humiliation for inheritance would be the performance. Do-hyun did not stop him. Joon-ho turned to his father and said he would remain CEO only if the board wanted him for his work, rather than his obedience as an heir. He would no longer live in the family residence during required events, accept personal funding from the family trust, or allow foundation staff to manage Hana's image. If those conditions cost him succession rights in the wider holding company, he was prepared to lose them. Sun-hee said Nia had poisoned him against his own blood. Joon-ho looked at Hana and replied that his blood was sleeping against his wife's shoulder. Nobody in the room had an answer for that. Nia walked out first, not because she had been expelled, but because staying 1 second longer would have taught Hana the wrong lesson. 5 minutes later, Joon-ho joined her at the front steps carrying their overnight bag, his suit jacket, and the family ring no longer on his hand. He put the bag into the car himself. Nia waited until the doors closed, before asking whether he understood what he had just done. Joon-ho said he understood what he should have done months earlier. Then he apologized for forcing Nia to survive repeated injuries, while he kept waiting for his mother to become reasonable on her own. Nia did not forgive everything inside the car. Real change deserved more than one dramatic sentence. even a sentence that had finally chosen the right side. But she reached across the console and took his hand, because for the first time he had stopped asking her to prove the problem before protecting their child. The consequences arrived before breakfast the next morning. A photograph from the Daljanchi had leaked to a business blog, showing Joon-ho leaving the family residence with Nia, Hana, and no signet ring. The caption claimed a private dispute had erupted over succession, and by noon 3 outlets were asking whether the Hanul CEO had broken with his family. Nia expected Sun-hee to remain silent. Instead, an unnamed Foundation source told one reporter that cultural misunderstandings had created unnecessary tension inside an otherwise welcoming family. The phrase cultural misunderstanding made Nia laugh once, without humor, because it was apparently easier to misunderstand racism than to admit someone had practiced it. Joon-ho wanted to issue a furious statement, naming everything his mother had said. Nia stopped him. She told him Hana did not need her first birthday turned into evidence for strangers who believed they were entitled to judge a child's grandmother. Joon-ho asked whether silence would let his mother's version harden into the public story. Nia said they did not need silence. They needed one truthful boundary, and no spectacle. Hanul issued a short statement saying Joon-ho's family living arrangements were private, and his position as CEO remained unchanged. Nia posted nothing. She spent the afternoon building a blanket fort in their apartment while Hana destroyed it repeatedly with the enthusiasm of a tiny demolition contractor. That quiet choice annoyed the press more than a scandalous response would have, and the story began losing momentum within 48 hours. Sun-hee's next move was less public and far more dangerous. 3 members of Hanul's board requested an emergency governance review concerning Joon-ho's management of the delayed Luminest launch and his wife's alleged influence over product decisions. One director had opposed the 4-month delay from the beginning, and now argued that personal relationships had compromised executive independence. Joon-ho received the notice at 7 in the evening, read it twice, and handed it to Nia without speaking. She recognized the strategy immediately. If the family conflict could be reframed as corporate interference, Sun-hee would not need to attack Nia's race publicly. She could attack her legitimacy instead. Nia asked whether his mother controlled those directors. Joon-ho said Sun-hee controlled nobody directly, but decades of family favors could make influence difficult to measure. He looked angrier with himself than with the board. Nia reminded him that the audit existed, the data existed, and his decision to delay Luminest had been documented before anyone knew the family conflict would become public. Joon-ho said facts did not always win board fights. Nia answered that facts did better when somebody organized them properly. The next morning, she contacted the university laboratory that had been discussing Hanul's independent validation consortium and disclosed the board review before signing anything. She wanted no appearance that she was using the proposed partnership to shield her husband. Then she recused herself from all negotiations involving Hanul until the governance review ended. That decision surprised Joon-ho. Nia told him she loved him enough not to become evidence his opponents could misuse, and respected herself enough not to hide from work she had earned. She continued her research with other companies and hospitals, leaving Hanul to defend its own decisions. For 3 weeks, Joon-ho went to work before sunrise, and came home after Hana was asleep. Nia saw the pressure in his shoulders, but she refused to turn their home into another boardroom. They talked about Hana, dinner, laundry, and whether the plant near the window was dying from neglect or excessive executive optimism. When Joon-ho tried to apologize for bringing corporate war into their marriage, Nia reminded him she had married a CEO, not a librarian. Then she added that she would have preferred a librarian's schedule. The governance committee interviewed 12 executives, 4 external auditors, 2 testing contractors, and eventually, Nia herself. She entered the board conference room wearing a navy suit and carrying no family photographs, wedding ring visible but otherwise irrelevant to what she intended to say. The committee chair asked whether Nia had instructed Joon-ho to delay Luminest. She said no. She had asked her husband one technical question at home after he voluntarily mentioned validation results. The chair asked whether she understood how much revenue Hanul lost because of that question. Nia replied that revenue lost before launch was measurable. while harm caused by an overstated medical claim could become measurable in far worse units. A director asked whether her professional specialty made her unusually sensitive to issues involving darker skin because she was black. The room became uncomfortable. Nia did not. She said being black made the consequences personally familiar, but her conclusion came from data, not identity. Then she asked whether the board would dismiss a fire engineer's warning because that engineer had once survived a fire. Nobody repeated the question. Nia presented no confidential information, only the original validation summary, the external audit findings already available to directors, and published methodological standards the team had failed to meet. She finished by telling the board that if Hanel needed her marriage to explain its engineering mistake, then the company had learned nothing from the mistake. The committee dismissed her after 43 minutes. Joon-ho was not permitted to speak with her until his own testimony ended. So Nia went home and made noodles with Denise over video call. 2 days later, the governance committee released its findings. Joon-ho had acted within executive authority. The launch delay had been supported by legitimate safety concerns, and no evidence showed improper access or interference by Nia. The committee went further. It criticized Hanel's original validation controls and recommended independent technical oversight for high-risk consumer health products. The director who had led the complaint resigned from the Product Oversight Committee after internal emails revealed he had pressured staff to preserve the original launch date. That was the first major public status reversal of the story. Nia had entered the conflict accused of meddling because she was the CEO's wife and left it recognized as the person who had noticed a legitimate blind spot. Joon-ho survived the review not because he protected Nia, but because the evidence proved both of them had made the responsible choice. At the next board meeting, he proposed the Independent University Consortium again. This time, the proposal passed unanimously. The university asked Nia to serve as one of several founding scientific advisors, but she accepted only after legal counsel created a structure preventing Hanul from controlling her appointment. She wanted the work because it mattered, not because it came with the satisfaction of watching Sun-hee lose an argument. Still, she was human enough to enjoy that satisfaction a little. If you had been standing in that boardroom, would you have trusted Nia's warning from the beginning, or waited for the outside audit? The question mattered because the next part of the story was not about proving Nia right anymore. She had won that argument. Now she and Joon-ho had to learn whether winning against a family system was easier than building a healthier family outside it. They moved from their river apartment into a slightly larger home near a park, not because they needed luxury, but because Hana had discovered running. Joon-ho insisted a 1-year-old could not technically run, and Hana disproved him by colliding with a sofa at impressive speed. Their evenings became ordinary in the best possible way. Nia worked 3 days each week at the university lab, consulted remotely on 2 American projects, and guarded Fridays for Hana whenever deadlines allowed. Joon-ho began leaving Hanul before 8 at night twice a week, an achievement his assistant treated like a historic labor reform. He learned to braid exactly one tiny section of Hana's curls, before admitting he needed professional instruction from Denise. Denise held a 40-minute video lesson, and graded him with the severity of a licensing board. Those scenes mattered because Joon-ho's grand gesture at the family house would have meant little if his daily choices remained unchanged. He stopped asking Nia when she might forgive Sun-hee. He stopped passing along his mother's invitations, unless they included a direct apology or a clear purpose. He also began therapy again, something he had tried briefly years earlier after his sister Ji-won left the family. Nia learned the full story during one quiet Sunday after Hana fell asleep between them on the couch. Ji-won had been 5 years older than Joon-ho. Brilliant, rebellious, and expected to become the first Park daughter to hold a senior role in the family company. At 29, she became engaged to a divorced Korean journalist from a working-class family, and Sun-hee considered the match humiliating. She pressured Ji-won for months, threatened to remove her from the family foundation, and eventually convinced Do-hyun to freeze part of her inheritance. Joon-ho had been 24. He loved his sister, disagreed with their mother, and said almost nothing because he believed the conflict would eventually calm down. Instead, Ji-won left Korea after the wedding, refused family money, and gradually stopped speaking to everyone except Joon-ho through occasional messages. The marriage itself later ended, which Sun-hee treated as proof that she had always been right. Ji-won saw it differently. She told Joon-ho the marriage ending had hurt, but losing her brother's voice when she needed him had hurt longer. Joon-ho carried that sentence for 12 years. Nia finally understood why he had spent months trying to negotiate peace with Sun-hee instead of drawing a hard boundary. He was not only afraid of losing his mother. He was terrified of becoming responsible for another permanent family rupture. Nia held his hand and told him something therapy had apparently not managed to make sound simple. Avoiding a choice was still a choice when someone else paid the cost. Joon-ho said he knew that now. Nia replied that knowing was useful, but repetition was how people became different. He smiled and told her she should put that on an invoice too. Do-hyun began visiting their new home alone. The first time, he arrived carrying an absurdly expensive wooden rocking horse that Hana immediately ignored in favor of the cardboard box. He apologized to Nia in the kitchen while Joon-ho assembled the horse badly in the living room. Do-hyun said he had spent decades letting Sun-hee manage the emotional life of the family because he managed the business one. He had called that division of labor, but looking at Ji-won's absence and Joon-ho's departure, he now recognized it as cowardice with a sketch. Nia respected the honesty, but she did not absolve him. She told him fathers did not become neutral simply because mothers spoke louder. Do-hyun nodded and said that was exactly what Ji-won had told him before leaving Korea. He had recently contacted her again. For the first time in years, she had agreed to answer a call. Nia did not tell Joon-ho immediately, because it was Do-hyun's news to share, and because she had learned not every family development needed her intervention. Sun-hee remained absent. She sent Hana a birthday gift through an assistant 2 weeks after the doljanchi. A gold bracelet engraved only with the Park surname. Nia returned it with a handwritten note saying Hana did not need jewelry from anyone unwilling to know the whole child wearing it. Sun-hee sent nothing else. 3 months passed. The Luminest redesign completed expanded trials across multiple hospitals, including deeper pigmentation ranges, premature infants, and several common movement conditions the original study had underrepresented. The new calibration performed significantly better, and Hanel prepared a transparent technical report explaining the delay instead of pretending the first version had never existed. Joon-ho wanted to announce the report personally. His communications team advised against mentioning Nia, worried the press would drag the family dispute back into a product launch. Joon-ho asked Nia what she wanted. She said she wanted the engineers who fixed the problem to receive credit, the hospitals that supplied better data to be thanked, and her marriage left out entirely. She did not need to become the heroic black wife who saved a Korean company from itself. The real lesson was more useful. Good systems should not require a marginalized person to notice every blind spot personally. Joon-ho used almost those exact words at the launch briefing. Without naming her, the product press responded better than expected. Several health technology publications praised Hanul for publishing the validation gap and redesign process, while competitors quietly updated their own testing statements. Nia watched the briefing from her university office and felt something more satisfying than vindication. The problem had changed the system. That evening, she and Joon-ho celebrated with takeout on the floor because Hana had thrown rice across the dining table and declared the high chair unacceptable. Peace lasted 9 more days. Then Sun-hee collapsed during a foundation luncheon. Do-hyun called Joon-ho from the ambulance, voice shaking in a way his son had never heard before. Doctors later determined Sun-hee had suffered a cardiac arrhythmia, complicated by dehydration and uncontrolled blood pressure. Serious but treatable, with monitoring and medication. Joon-ho reached the hospital before she was moved from emergency observation. Nia arrived 20 minutes later with Hana asleep in a carrier and found her husband standing alone near a vending machine. For a moment, his face looked 24 again. He told Nia he could hear his mother's voice in his head blaming stress, the board conflict, the family fracture, and everything that had happened since the doljanchi. Nia asked whether Sun-hee had actually said any of that. Joon-ho said no. That frightened him more, because the guilt no longer required his mother's participation. This was the mirror of the choice he had always made before: rush toward peace, surrender boundaries, and call sacrifice responsibility. Nia did not tell him what to do. She said his mother was sick, and loving a sick parent did not require pretending the parent had never caused harm. Joon-ho asked whether she would understand if he stayed at the hospital overnight. Nia told him she would have been disappointed if he did not. Then she added that staying beside his mother was not the same thing as moving his wife and child back under her control. Joon-ho nodded slowly. The distinction seemed obvious when Nia said it, which was usually how the most difficult truths behaved. He stayed until morning. Nia took Hana home, slept badly, and returned after breakfast with coffee and clean clothes for Joon-ho. Sun-hee was awake by then, pale, irritated by the hospital gown, and furious that a nurse had limited her phone calls. When Nia entered, the room went quiet. Sun-hee looked at Hana first. For months, Nia had imagined what she might say if given one private chance to confront her mother-in-law, without an audience. None of the speeches survived the actual room. She simply asked whether Sun-hee wanted them to leave. Sun-hee looked toward Joon-ho, perhaps expecting him to answer for her. He did not. After a long silence, Sun-hee said Hana could stay. Nia remained standing. She said permission was not what she had asked. Sun-hee closed her eyes for several seconds, then admitted she did not know how to speak to Nia without every sentence becoming evidence against her. Nia answered that honesty would be a useful experiment. Sun-hee almost smiled, then stopped herself. She said she had grown up inside a family where appearance, schools, marriages, accents, and even children's faces were treated as messages about whether the family was succeeding. Her own mother had criticized her nose, her height, and the darkness of her skin after summers outdoors, because daughters were expected to look refined. Nia listened carefully, but did not let explanation become absolution. Sun-hee said when Joon-ho married Nia, she told herself she was modern enough to accept what older relatives might criticize. Then Hana was born, and Sun-hee saw strangers looking twice, relatives whispering, and photographers choosing angles that made the family's difference impossible to ignore. She admitted that instead of confronting her own shame, she tried to control the image. Nia asked the question that mattered. Was Sun-hee ashamed of Hana? Sun-hee cried before answering. She said she had been ashamed of what other people might think, then behaved as though the child was responsible for those thoughts. Nia told her there was no meaningful difference to a little girl who would eventually understand who kept moving her out of photographs. Sun-hee nodded. She said she knew. Then she apologized without adding tradition, misunderstanding, stress, or intention after the apology. She said she had treated Nia as though marriage required gratitude, treated Hana as though belonging required visual permission, and forced Joon-ho into a loyalty test no mother should create. Nia did not rush across the room and embrace her. Forgiveness was not a prize people received for finally describing their own behavior accurately. She told Sun-hee she appreciated the apology and believed change would have to become visible over time. Sun-hee asked whether she would be allowed to know Hana. Nia said that depended on whether Hana could know her without learning to dislike any part of herself. The answer hurt Sun-hee, which was not the same thing as cruelty. Joon-ho stood beside the window and said nothing until his mother looked directly at him. Then he told her he loved her, would help during her recovery, and would not return to the old family arrangement. Sun-hee asked whether that meant he still refused the succession plan. Joon-ho said yes. She looked stunned, because some part of her had assumed illness would restore the world to its previous shape. He explained that leaving the succession plan was no longer punishment for her behavior. It was a decision about the life he wanted. He wanted to lead Hanul while the board trusted him, raise Hana without inheritance being used as discipline, and repair his relationship with Ji-won if she allowed it. Sun-hee's face changed at her daughter's name. Do-hyun, who had been silent near the door, admitted he had spoken with Ji-won twice that month. Sun-hee stared at him as if he had announced a second secret family. He said Ji-won might return to Seoul for a short visit, but only if nobody treated the trip as reconciliation she had not promised. For once, Sun-hee did not argue with conditions. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than Nia had ever seen her, not because illness erased her power, but because control had stopped working as a language. Hana woke and began fussing inside the carrier. Nia lifted her out, and the child immediately reached toward the shiny hospital identification band on Sun-hee's wrist. Sun-hee looked at Nia before touching her granddaughter. Nia gave a small nod. Sun-hee held out one finger. Hana grabbed it, examined it seriously, then tried to put it in her mouth. Do-hyun laughed so loudly the nurse opened the door to check on them. Nobody called the moment healing. It was simply a beginning small enough to be believable. Sun-hee returned home 5 days later with medication, dietary restrictions, and strict instructions she resented almost as much as being unable to control everyone else's schedule. Joon-ho arranged a private nurse for the first week, but he did not move back into the family residence or ask Nia to visit more often. He went twice that week, once alone and once with Hana after Nia agreed, then returned home before dinner both times. The new boundaries were almost boring in their consistency, which was exactly why Nia trusted them more than dramatic promises. Sun-hee began sending messages directly instead of through assistants. At first they were stiff, practical notes asking whether Hana had recovered from a cold or whether a particular toy contained small parts. Nia answered when an answer was appropriate and ignored messages that drifted toward scheduling their lives. A month later, Sun-hee asked whether she could visit the park near their home rather than summon everyone to the family residence. Nia agreed to 1 hour. Sun-hee arrived early, wore flat shoes for the first time Nia had ever seen, and carried no gifts. Hana spent 40 minutes collecting leaves, throwing them down, and demanding that every adult admire the same stone repeatedly. Sun-hee followed her without complaining about dirt on her trousers. When 2 older women recognized Joon-ho and glanced curiously at Hana, Nia saw Sun-hee notice them. Months earlier, that glance would have changed her posture, her voice, or where she positioned the child. This time, Sun-hee lifted Hana onto the bench beside her and continued feeding her pieces of pear. She did not perform the moment for Nia. That made it matter. Change arrived in other small ways. Sun-hee asked Denise for advice about Hana's curls instead of buying products selected by an assistant who had never cared for textured hair. Denise responded with a list so detailed it included photographs, warnings, and 3 capitalized sentences about never brushing dry curls. Sun-hee followed the instructions with the concentration of someone negotiating an international treaty. When Hana screamed during the first attempt, Sun-hee called Denise directly rather than blaming the child's hair for being difficult. Denise later told Nia she remained suspicious but respected anybody willing to admit she did not know what she was doing. Nia said that was practically a blessing coming from her mother. Meanwhile, Ji-won finally returned to Seoul. She arrived alone on a gray November morning, carrying 1 suitcase and no intention of staying longer than 4 days. Joon-ho met her at the airport without cameras, family staff, or the black sedan the Park family usually sent for important arrivals. Nia waited at home with Hana because Ji-won had not met her and might not want a reunion expanded into a family ceremony. When Joon-ho returned 3 hours later, his eyes were red. He told Nia his sister had punched his shoulder before hugging him, which sounded exactly like the woman he remembered. Ji-won came to dinner the next evening. She was 41, elegant, without trying, with Joon-ho's dark eyes and none of his instinct to soften uncomfortable truths. She hugged Nia before sitting down and said she had followed the family scandal online with equal parts horror and satisfaction. Then she apologized for the satisfaction, though not very convincingly. Hana stared at Ji-won for several minutes, then climbed into her lap after discovering the silver bracelet on her wrist. Ji-won froze. She had no children and admitted later that she had avoided thinking about nieces or nephews because family milestones always reminded her what she had lost. Nia watched her hold Hana carefully and understood another cost of Sun-hee's obsession with preserving family image. It had not preserved the family at all. It had scattered people until photographs became easier to arrange because fewer people remained willing to stand in them. Ji-won agreed to see Do-hyun the following day at a restaurant, neutral ground she selected herself. She refused to see Sun-hee until the last day of her trip. Sun-hee accepted the condition without sending intermediaries to change it. That alone told Ji-won something had shifted. Their meeting happened in the same garden room where the disastrous 100th day photographs had been taken. Nia was not present for the first hour, and Joon-ho stayed only because Ji-won asked him to. Later, Ji-won told Nia that their mother had apologized badly at first. Sun-hee began by explaining what she had feared, who had pressured her, and how different expectations had been when Ji-won was younger. Ji-won stopped her and said explanations could come after ownership, not before it. Sun-hee started again. This time she apologized for using money, family status, and affection as tools to force obedience. Ji-won did not forgive her that day. She did agree to return for another visit in the spring. That was enough. The Park family had spent years confusing reunion with resolution, as though appearing in the same room meant nobody needed to discuss why they had left. Nia appreciated that Ji-won refused that shortcut. By winter, the Independent University Consortium began publishing its first methodology papers on equitable validation for home health sensors. Nia's name appeared among 7 founding advisors, no larger than anyone else's and unconnected to her marriage in the author biography. She preferred it that way. Her work expanded beyond Hanyul, attracting 2 hospital systems and a European device manufacturer willing to submit products to the same independent standards. One afternoon, the university dean offered Nia a permanent leadership position directing a new center for inclusive health technology design. The job would keep her in Seoul for at least 3 years and give her a budget larger than any project she had led before. Nia read the offer twice, then realized something strange. For the first time since marrying Joon-ho, a major decision about her future had nothing to do with whether she could fit inside the Park family. She wanted the job because it was hers. Joon-ho celebrated before she had formally accepted, ordering champagne and forgetting that Hana had recently learned how to climb dining chairs. They spent the next 20 minutes protecting the bottle from their daughter while arguing about whether this counted as sophisticated family celebration. Nia accepted the position the next morning. She kept Carter professionally, as she always had, and used Park only on documents where Korean law or family registration required it. Nobody in the household treated that as a referendum on love. The second Luminest launch happened almost a year after the original schedule. Hanyul released the expanded validation results publicly, including the failure that had caused the delay and the exact changes made afterward. The redesigned monitor became the company's most trusted pediatric product within 6 months, not because consumers forgot the problem, but because the company had shown its work. Joon-ho received praise for the decision, but he redirected interviews toward the engineers, clinicians, auditors, and external consortium that had corrected the system. He had learned something from Nia too. Leadership did not become smaller when credit was distributed honestly. The board renewed his CEO contract for another 4 years. Do-yeon privately asked whether Joon-ho would reconsider becoming chairman of the larger family holding company after his eventual retirement. Joon-ho declined. His father asked whether that decision was still about Sun-hee. Joon-ho said no. He had discovered he liked leading one company. He understood more than inheriting authority over 6 companies, merely because his surname qualified him. Do-hyun looked disappointed for perhaps 10 seconds, then admitted that might be the healthiest business judgment any Park heir had ever made. He began discussing a professional succession process with the board rather than treating inheritance as management strategy. Sun-hee hated the idea initially. Then she surprised everyone by supporting it publicly at the next family foundation meeting. She said dynasties often mistook continuity for competence, and the foundation should stop teaching young relatives that a surname was a job qualification. Nia read the transcript twice to make sure someone had not hacked the foundation website. When she teased Sun-hee about it later, her mother-in-law answered that heart medication had apparently caused radical thinking. It was the first joke they had shared without tension hiding underneath. Before the gala, Sun-hee faced a smaller test that Nia never expected to hear about. At a private luncheon, one of Sun-hee's oldest friends asked whether Hana would eventually look less foreign as she grew older. The woman apparently meant the question as harmless curiosity, the same disguise Sun-hee herself had once used in the hospital. Months earlier, Sun-hee might have changed the subject, smiled politely, or protected the friendship from discomfort. Instead, she asked what part of her Korean granddaughter the woman considered foreign. The table went silent. Her friend tried to laugh and said Sun-hee knew exactly what she meant. Sun-hee answered that she did know, which was why she was asking her to say it clearly. The woman became offended and accused Sun-hee of turning an innocent comment into an accusation. Sun-hee told her that innocence did not improve merely because the speaker disliked hearing the meaning repeated back. The friendship cooled after that lunch. Nia learned about the exchange from Do-yeon, not Sun-hee, and initially suspected he was trying to advertise his wife's improvement. Do-yeon said Sun-hee had specifically asked him not to tell Nia because she did not want basic decency treated like a performance review. That detail mattered more than the confrontation itself. Nia had spent too much of her life watching people behave correctly, only when the person they might hurt was standing close enough to notice. Real change happened in rooms where applause was unavailable. Around the same time, Nia opened the first laboratory of her new university center with a staff chosen from engineering, medicine, design, and community health. She refused to call the center a diversity initiative, because its purpose was not decorating science with better language. Its purpose was building products that worked for the actual range of people expected to trust them. At the opening seminar, a graduate student asked whether Nia's experience with Hanul had made her distrust private industry. Nia said the opposite. She distrusted any system, public or private, that rewarded certainty more quickly than correction. Then she pointed toward the redesigned, luminescent unit displayed beside several competing devices, and explained why failure could become useful when institutions stopped hiding it. Joon-ho watched from the back row, without sitting on stage, appearing only as Nia's husband, until a student recognized him during the reception. When someone asked why the CEO of Hanul had not been introduced formally, Joon-ho said this was Dr. Carter's room, not his. Nia heard the answer across the crowd and smiled before returning to a conversation with her research team. It was another quiet reversal from the early days of their marriage, when every room in Seoul seemed determined to define her through his surname. Now Joon-ho understood that loving her sometimes meant stepping out of the center rather than dragging her into it. The following week, Sun-hee visited the center privately and asked Nia to explain the calibration cards she used in optical testing. Nia showed her how sensor performance could change across pigmentation ranges when developers assumed one body represented everyone. Sun-hee listened for nearly an hour. Before leaving, she touched one of the darkest calibration cards and said quietly that machines were not the only things people designed badly when they assumed difference was a defect. Nia did not answer immediately. She finally said the useful part of discovering a bad design was deciding what to rebuild. Sun-hee nodded and left without asking whether the sentence meant she had been forgiven. Still, the largest test came at the Park Foundation's annual Winter Gala. Sun-hee had chaired the event for nearly 20 years, and it remained one of the most photographed social occasions connected to the family. Nia had avoided the gala since Hana's birth, unwilling to place her daughter inside another performance about who looked acceptable beside whom. This year, Sun-hee asked them to attend. Nia did not answer immediately. She asked why Sun-hee wanted Hana there. Sun-hee said because she wanted her granddaughter at a family event and because avoiding public discomfort had already cost the family enough. Then she added that Nia was free to say no, and the invitation would remain an invitation rather than a test. That sentence convinced Nia more than any promise about photographs. They attended. Hana was nearly 2 by then, more interested in chandeliers than donors, and determined to walk everywhere without holding an adult hand. Nia wore a deep green gown designed by a Korean-American designer she admired. Her curls loose around her shoulders because nobody had asked them to behave. Joon-ho wore the same black suit style he always preferred, but the jade signet ring remained absent from his hand. Do-hyun had offered it back months earlier. Joon-ho told his father he no longer needed an object to prove where he belonged. The ring stayed in a small box at home. When the formal family photograph was announced, Nia felt her body tighten before her mind could stop it. Sun-hee noticed. She did not call staff, rearrange chairs, or ask anyone to wait upstairs. She walked across the room, took Hana's hand, and asked the child whether she wanted to stand beside grandma or beside her mother. Hana chose neither. She marched directly toward Do-hyun and demanded to be lifted. Everyone laughed, including Nia. The photographer arranged the group around Hana, instead of arranging Hana around the group. Ji-won stood beside Joon-ho, having returned to Seoul for her second visit as promised. Denise, visiting for the holidays, stood beside Nia and whispered that she had never seen so many expensive people struggle to make a toddler face the camera. Sun-hee heard her and laughed. The photograph took less than a minute. Nobody was removed. Nobody was hidden. Nobody asked whether one face made the family look different. The difference was the family. Later that evening, a reporter approached Sun-hee near the ballroom entrance and asked about the public family conflict from the previous year. Nia expected a polished answer about privacy. Sun-hee surprised her again. She said there had been no cultural misunderstanding. She had made choices rooted in prejudice and fear of public judgment. And her son and daughter-in-law had been right to set boundaries. The reporter looked startled enough to forget the next question. Sun-hee added that she was still repairing the damage and did not consider one apology proof of transformation. Nia had not requested that statement. Joon-ho had not approved it. It mattered because Sun-hee finally accepted public responsibility in the same social world she had once been desperate to control. The clip spread online by morning. Some viewers praised her. Others said accountability had come too late. And several argued over whether people truly changed after decades of prejudice. Nia read none of the comments after the first 10 minutes. She did not need strangers to vote on whether her family had healed enough. Healing was happening in smaller places the internet could not measure. It happened when Sun-hee asked before touching Hana's hair. It happened when Ji-won sent photographs from her third visit without cropping anyone out. It happened when Do-hyun stopped referring to Joon-ho's career as the family future and started asking what his son actually wanted. It happened when Joon-ho heard his mother criticize an interracial couple at another foundation dinner and corrected the comment before Nia even entered the room. Most importantly, it happened when Hana grew old enough to notice her own reflection and never once heard anyone in the family describe her features as a problem. Nia guarded that fiercely. One spring afternoon, Hana sat on the floor of Nia's university office while her mother finished reviewing a clinical testing report. The child had found a box of skin tone calibration cards used in optical sensor research and scattered them across the carpet like playing cards. Nia looked down and laughed at the accidental symbolism. Hana held up the darkest card, pressed it against her own arm, then pressed a lighter one against Nia's hand and declared both of them pretty. Nia asked who had taught her that word. Hana pointed proudly toward herself. That answer nearly broke Nia in the best possible way. She finished work early and took Hana to meet Joon-ho at a riverside park. He arrived carrying convenience store coffee for Nia and a small paper bag of strawberries for Hana. Their daughter ran toward him with both arms raised, curls bouncing behind her, and Joon-ho crouched before she reached him. He lifted her high enough to make Nia complain, which only encouraged Hana to demand another turn. Sun-hee joined them 20 minutes later, walking slowly after her cardiac rehabilitation appointment. She did not arrive with staff or a photographer. She brought a small container of sliced pear, and asked Hana whether she could sit beside her. Hana nodded, then immediately stole Sun-hee's sunglasses. Joon-ho laughed so hard he nearly spilled Nia's coffee. For a while, nobody discussed the past. They watched Hana chase pigeons, lose interest, return for fruit, and attempt to wear the sunglasses upside down. Nia understood then that forgiveness had never needed to mean pretending the first year had not happened. The past remained part of the family because consequences were part of memory. Sun-hee would always be the woman who had once looked at a newborn granddaughter and wondered aloud whether her skin would change. She was also becoming the grandmother who now carried sunscreen formulated for Hana's skin, learned curl care from Denise, and corrected relatives before Nia had to. Both truths could exist without canceling each other. That evening, Joon-ho opened the small drawer where he kept the jade signet ring. He had not worn it since the night he left the family residence. Nia asked why he was looking at it. Joon-ho said his father wanted the ring returned to the family archive if he did not intend to use it as the designated heir. Nia expected him to hesitate. Instead, he closed the box and said he would return it the next morning. Then he pulled a cheap plastic ring from his pocket. One Hana had won from a capsule machine near the park. It was bright purple, slightly too small, and decorated with a crooked plastic star. Hana had apparently insisted that Daddy needed a family ring. Joon-ho pushed it onto his little finger and asked whether Nia thought the board would respect it. Nia said the board had survived worse accessories. The next morning, Joon-ho returned the jade ring to Do-hyun. His father held it for a long moment, then placed it inside the family archive box witout argument. He told Joon-ho that for years he believed inheritance was how a father guaranteed continuity. Now he thought perhaps the better inheritance was giving children enough freedom to refuse what no longer fit them. Joon-ho thanked him. Then he went to work wearing Hana's ridiculous purple ring, until his assistant finally asked whether it was a new design partnership. He said yes, with a very demanding creative director. The photograph from the Winter Gala eventually replaced an older family portrait in the entrance hall of the park residence. Sun-hee made that decision herself. The old photograph had shown perfect clothing, careful spacing, and 3 generations arranged with almost architectural precision. The new one was objectively messier. Hana was looking away from the camera, Denise was laughing, Ji-won's shoulder blocked part of Joon-ho's sleeve, and Do-hyun's tie sat slightly crooked. Nia loved it immediately. Months later, she noticed something else about where Sun-hee had placed it. It hung in the exact garden corridor where the family had once tried to remove Hana from the frame. Nia never asked whether that placement was intentional. Some symbols worked better without explanation. On Hana's 3rd birthday, the family gathered at Nia and Joon-ho's home instead of the park residence. There were no donors, no foundation staff, no official photographers, and no discussion of which traditions needed protecting. Denise made a cake too large for the table. Ji-won flew in from Singapore with a suitcase Hana immediately attempted to open. Do-hyun brought books instead of a giant toy after finally learning his granddaughter preferred boxes to expensive objects. Sun-hee arrived last, carrying no jewelry and no matching outfits. She brought a framed copy of the Winter Gala photograph. On the back, she had written one sentence in Korean and English. A family is not preserved by deciding who disappears from the picture. Nia read it twice. Sun-hee waited, visibly nervous, which might have been the strangest reversal of their entire relationship. Nia did not give a speech. She hugged her mother-in-law once, briefly and honestly, then placed the photograph beside the birthday cake. Joon-ho saw what was written on the back and looked toward his mother. Neither of them needed to say anything. Hana, who had no interest in symbolic closure, shoved one finger into the frosting and announced that everyone was taking too long. The adults laughed and finally listened to her. Later, after the guests left, and Hana fell asleep surrounded by opened books and discarded ribbon, Nia stood beside the living room window with Joon-ho. He asked whether she ever regretted marrying into his family. Nia considered the question carefully. She said she regretted every time they had asked her to doubt what she could clearly see. She regretted the hospital silence, the missing photographs, the coded invitations, and every month Joon-ho hoped patience would solve what boundaries should have stopped. But she did not regret him. She did not regret Hana. And she did not regret refusing to become smaller, just to make a powerful family more comfortable with seeing itself change. Joon-ho told her he used to think protecting his family meant keeping everyone together. Now he understood that sometimes protection meant being willing to walk out of a beautiful house before the people inside taught your child she should disappear. Nia looked toward the hallway where Hana slept. Their daughter would grow up Korean and Black, Park and Carter, surrounded by 2 languages, 2 grandmothers, and more opinions than any child reasonably needed. She would also grow up knowing none of those parts competed for permission to exist. That was the ending Nia had wanted long before she knew how to name it. Not revenge against Sun-hee. Not a billionaire husband rescuing her from cruelty. Not a perfect family pretending prejudice had vanished because one photograph looked happy. The real victory was simpler and harder. Nia had kept her dignity, protected her daughter, preserved her own work, and required the people who loved her to grow instead of merely claiming they did. Joon-ho had learned that love without boundaries could become another form of cowardice, and that choosing his wife did not require hating his mother. Sun-hee had learned that tradition could explain where a fear came from without making that fear worthy of obedience. Do-hyun had learned that silence from the quieter parent still shaped the family as surely as control from the louder one. And Hana, the child someone once considered too visibly different for a family portrait, became the person around whom that family finally learned to stand honestly. The next morning, Nia found Joon-ho making breakfast with the purple plastic ring still stuck on his little finger. She asked whether he had forgotten to remove it before sleeping, He looked at the ring, then toward Hana's empty high chair, and said he had decided this inheritance suited him better. Nia laughed, poured her coffee, and opened the curtains to a bright Seoul morning. For once, there was nothing waiting outside the frame that needed to be hidden.